Welcome. All right, so let me get your names down. Any questions as we're beginning? Have you had a chance to look at the test questions? All right, so let's take a look at those first, okay? Let me share the page. Let's see here. After number 20, okay? These pertain to this topic. What was not cited as an alleged catalyst for America's second great industrial revolution. Then conflict history identifies certain demographics as casualties of progress. Then the Gilded Age supposedly entailed an increase in per capita income and consumption, ironically alongside a broadening gulf between the wealthy and the poverty-stricken. Is that true or false? Then Carnegie, what was a message about Carnegie, the particular section on him, should you choose that one, also on your assignment. Then conflict history on the robber barons and what they did, what they achieved. How does conflict history look at that? We're going to take a look at that today. And then what about the argument for a plutocratic government, a government friendly to the rich? All right, you have that on the second to last section. A couple questions more micro about the Interstate Commerce Act and Sherman Antitrust Act, the Wabash versus Illinois decision. And somewhere here along, I was supposed to have a question about Trachtenberg. And so I may, if I do not have that, I'm going to add that, okay? And I will add next week the Gilded Age Part 2 pertaining to immigrant groups, and it'll pertain to this next one, number 30. But I also want you to know, and I apologize, Alan Trachtenberg's thesis, all right, on number 29. So I'll revise that and post it, okay? So let's get right into the Gilded Age assignment. So firstly, right, from the time of the Civil War, it was really kicked off by the Civil War. America's, you have indices that you try to use, right? An index plural, as far as how an economy's state is. And one of the simple ones is the GNP or GDP. And it's been so long since I've been in macroeconomics, I can't hardly recall the difference. But mainly, we're looking at the value of all products being produced and sold, okay? Then you're looking at widespread consumption. You're looking at geographic commerce spreading. And you're looking at the manner by which productivity is brought about. All those things radically changed, radically increased during this time, and they call it the Second Industrial Revolution, from the time about the Civil War up through World War I, all right? But we're pertaining mainly in the Gilded Age, what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age, from about 1870s up to 1900. To the gilded thing, right? The analogy is if something evidently in metallurgy is gilded, it's superficially fixed. It can remain corroded from within, and you simply put a nice gloss of something that looks nice over the top of it. And that was his metaphor for the time period, that on the superficial level, things looked wonderful. Times were booming. People were out consuming goods, enjoying leisure time for the first time in quite some time. Lots of novelties with technology. Very much the birth of what we're familiar with now in what some people would call by now a post-industrial world. All right, so a lot of that which we're familiar from the industrial period really took off during this time period. And why is that? All right. And so with number one, this is court history. This is claiming that we are an exceptional country and we're patting ourselves on the back saying this is why we had our second industrial revolution. We with a metaphor of a plant, right? And the plant being industrial development and commercial development, which is just trade, right? That that plant needed to be placed in good fertile soil. If not, the plant doesn't grow well, right? The soil pretty much dictates the health of the plant. So at any rate, what did we do to create metaphorically fertile soil for industrialization to take off? So for one, right, you see the legal component to it, the legal component to this argument, and that is that structurally in our government we created an environment for all this to happen. So for one, right, it's a praise of capitalism as opposed to mercantilism or different derivations of Marxism, where you have a free market. Access to resources are supposed to be open to all. Private property, private pursuit of gain, competition, and the government under laissez-faire rhetoric stays out, right? And you got to remember the context, as Adam Smith wrote this during the Enlightenment, and we had a mercantilist government with lots of mercantilist restrictions. From your 101 class, if you look at the Navigation Acts, they stated who could get involved in what industries, who was licensed to trade in what commodities, et cetera. In a capitalist economy, right, by contrast of a mercantilist economy, is very egalitarian. It puts everyone on equal footing. Anyone can go out now and pursue whatever industry, whatever enterprise he or she wants to do, right? And so for one was the capitalist economy, but not laissez-faire. As much as we have always had laissez-faire in our rhetoric, the government has never kept its hands completely out, right? And one example of that are tariffs. They put import tariffs to protect our infant industries. So when an industry is going, right, when you crunch numbers, sometimes I'll do it if we were in class, like on a board, and you only had $1 million to start with, and you surmise how much you're going to need in laborers, how much you're going to need in machinery, how much you're going to need for the facilities that you're renting or buying, specialized mechanics of some sort to keep the machines working well, etc. That all constitutes your overhead, the money you got to pay out, right? Well, when you crunch all the numbers and you get to the number of commodities that are being produced, you could only go so low on your commodity before you lose money, right? You can only go so low on the price of each product. But a bigger, well-established organization that has more money to play with, more capital to begin with, can afford a heavy overhead to pay out better than you can, and produces a lot more quantity-wise of whatever product you're producing. That person can, through economies of scale, could undersell you, right? They could pull a Walmart on you and go a cheaper price and have people buy their product instead of yours. And so the beginning industries like textiles and so forth, like with clothing, in Flanders, Belgium, and in other places of Europe were light years ahead of ours. Remember, ours began very late, not until really the 1790s, and they were by way of European immigrants like Samuel Slater in the New England states. And so we were a step behind. So what the government did is they put an artificial tax, oftentimes, you guys, at 100%. They put an artificial tax at up to 100% on the price of a foreign product. So let's say a t-shirt from a textile mill from Flanders, and let's say that it costs 10 cents. They put a 10-cent tax on it. So now it costs 20 cents in America, as opposed to 10 cents back in Belgium. And now that gives some wiggle room to our beginning textile manufacturers to say, okay, great, thank God I couldn't compete with 10 cents per shirt, but I can compete with 20 cents per shirt. So I could put mine down to about 16 cents or 17 cents. And still Americans will buy the American-made product because it's cheaper. And so those type of import tariffs had existed from the get-go to try to help out our manufacturers. And then they could be subsidized in a myriad of ways. So like I said, it was never truly laissez-faire. They could have bond money, like the railroads, where the government lends money from the public, right, and slowly pays them back. And with that, those bond certificates, issue those bond certificates to a company to help them with the costs of construction, especially like with the railroads, etc. So they'd have bond initiatives. They would have tax breaks that they would offer them. And then sometimes outright subsidies, just outright money that didn't have to be paid back like the bonds did. And so with the subsidies, sometimes with the railroads, it was in land, right? They would get so much land on each side of every mile of track that they laid as an incentive to help them. And we saw from the West, it started off with $1.25 an acre, and the railroads began selling it for over $5 an acre. So they were no dummies. They took advantage of this, right, to try to enrich themselves and better equip themselves to lay future miles of track. And so they also insisted on normalization, trying to make things homogeneous so that there could be some the same expectation, like with gauges of tracks, so that it was like what, 4 feet, 5.5 inches or 8.5 inches was the width of the tracks that you had to lay. So then that you could connect track line, or they call them trunk line after trunk line after trunk line, for the infrastructure of the entire country. And so railroads alone, right? And by 1883, they issued the time zones that we're familiar with for deliveries and pickups, et cetera, to be more predictable for the railroad guys and for the businessmen that were connected to the railroads. And so by the late 1800s, the railroads came of age, and they connected areas that had previously not been connected, right? Because we had very distinctive regions. We had the Northeast, and it had its own kind of flavor, if you will. You have the Deep South as opposed to the Upper South. There were differences there. You had the old Midwest with the Great Lakes region, and then everything else was a broad variety of the far West of different ecosystems therein. The railroads are going to connect all that, right? And so now it's going to start just a broad array of other industries. People are going to be licking their lips trying to make money off those railroads, right? They're going to go along the railroad depots and form cities and businesses and try to make as much money as they can. Bankers are going to go and follow the railroads and try to lend money for interest and make money off of that, right? Off of credit, being creditors. And so the railroads alone are going to connect the regions and open up a broad array of other types of things. Another thing that was really big with the government was making a worthwhile system of patents, a very generous offer to those who would come up with some type of an invention. And so it made it worthwhile, knowing that you could become rich and even famous on inventing something. But that wasn't enough, because from there, you have people like Charles Goodyear, the inventor of vulcanized rubber, that Goodyear tires are named after. He was arrested like 2 or 3 times at least for debts, because under English common law, you could be arrested for debts, non-payment of debts. And he was literally trying to invent his vulcanized rubber in his jail cell on a regular basis. And so he wasn't able to feed his family and invent at the same time. So then something changes with corporations, and we're going to get back to that in just a moment. But sticking with government, then what the government also did is made decisions throughout the 1800s to create a business-friendly environment, so that when you have money and you want to pursue the American dream, you think, okay, again, back then, the main stepping stone to the American dream arguably was not academia, as I like to think that it still is getting your degrees, but it was by way of starting a business, becoming an entrepreneur. But with that, you needed to have a business license. You needed to have a credit available to you. And you also needed to, in starting a business, you needed several other things, to be honest. But at any rate, in doing so, you wanted to make sure that the government was friendly to your contracts, to your business contracts in particular. So, and it was not going to intervene in your quest for profit. So at any rate, a few cases here. Let's see here. Fletcher versus Peck in 1810 was a judicial decision that stated that contracts are inviolable. They're not unviolated. They're not violated and abrogated because there might be one party who engages in fraudulent activity. In this case, one party was unaware of the fraud that was going on, and so they tried to eradicate the whole business contract. But on account of the innocent party, they said, no, it's still a contract. And to their mind, in their estimation, there was no fraud involved. So it secured contracts, right? And made them almost sacred in America. And you go into Latin America and you go into other countries, that's not the case. It was more of a business risk. Dartmouth versus Woodward. The state of New Hampshire tried to take over Dartmouth College and make it a public school, and they lost. And in the Dartmouth decision, they decided that to put restrictions on the ability of state governments to control private operations. And so again, that was a big one for businesses because they're telling the states to keep their hand out. Speaking of which, Cohens versus Virginia. You don't have to memorize these. But in Cohens versus Virginia, there was a state law that abrogated a business contract, and it was decided in the state Supreme Court to abrogate it. I don't remember the circumstances. And the federal government intervened and overturned the decision and said, no, states don't have a right to abrogate business contracts except under extreme conditions. And so again, it's protecting businesses. Let's see here, what else? Gibbons versus Ogden, as well as Wabash versus Illinois, stated that if you're in a state, you're conducting a business, and the state wants to regulate it. If you do business beyond your state's lines with another state, then technically you're involved in interstate commerce. And under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, interstate commerce belongs to Congress's jurisdiction, not the states. So you see time after time, these conservative judges made decisions to nationalize the issue of trade and contracts and so forth. And they knew that was wonderful because the national government was doing nothing to abrogate them. It was the state laws that wanted to regulate them, etc. And that's a whole other can of worms to get into, because oftentimes debtors, those who were in debt, those who were facing parasitical behavior on behalf of corporations, they oftentimes have a better, kind of in Jeffersonian rhetoric at least, they have a better opportunity to go to the smaller state government level and get their grievance redressed. For one, state governments are pretty democratic. Governor and assemblymen of the state legislators are all popularly elected. And so it seems like when there have been movements that have been anti-corporation, they tend to be more grassroots and local oriented. It's with the states usually that crack down on the corporation. So now these decisions, they're taking it out of the state's powers, right? And they're giving it to the federal government instead. And the federal government's doing nothing. Exactly what the entrepreneurs want. They want to be left alone and to pursue wealth. Okay, so again, this is all contending that the federal government is doing everything it can to facilitate economic growth, to create an environment that is conducive to commercial development and entrepreneurial pursuits and freedom, right? And then also the state governments made it easier to get contracts for your starting a business. Back from English common law, there were many obstacles. I'm trying to remember what some of them were in particular, but there were many obstacles to go through to be able to start an official sanctioned business. States made it very easy, where you paid a small fee, provided your identification and residency in the state, and they allowed you to start that business. And not to mention the fees went down after the Jacksonian period. And so it became cheaper as well. And then also states and the federal government was growing in its connections, international connections. And JP Morgan was an example of that, having connections with through his father in England in particular, whereby our banks were meshing their assets and their governing boards, et cetera, with those of European banks. And so that more capital came into the country at this time. For instance, in the cattle industry, the Scots alone got heavily invested into the cattle industry all the way up in Scotland. And so that all plays out for more money to play with, right, for corporations. The corporations also, as of the 1840s, issued limited liability laws, so that now whenever you buy a share in stock of a company, all you risk is the amount of money that you have invested in buying those shares, however many shares that you bought. If the company goes under, if the company becomes indebted, that's not your problem, right? Your only issue is what you personally invested. And so that gives the incentive to more people throughout the world, not just the country, to buy shares in the NASDAQ stock market. So at any rate, that increased. And so with the public corporations, they have a large influx of capital, of money to begin with, money to play with from shareholders, right? And so with that extra money, they not only have a plethora of people, so population and numbers matter. We have a plentiful labor pool, okay, and that helped as well for the Industrial Revolution, especially with immigration, as we get into next week. And so they got plenty of workers to do the work for them. But also, right, is the scientific community, for various reasons, just took off in the 1800s. And almost in no case did they take off from scratch. Even the most famous, like Nikola Tesla with alternating current and his electric coil, et cetera, and the use of electrical power. You look at plenty of predecessors before him back in Europe who had found some very important discoveries through experimentation, et cetera. And so now it was like a time where they were cashing in on and stepping on the shoulders of previous generations of what they had discovered in science. And not just that, but like Charles Goodyear's dilemma, right, is now the scientific community has the means to be able to engage in 24/7 scientific development without worrying about having a side job to feed their families, because the corporations began investing in research and development. And so they began going literally to Europe in particular, to the great universities of Prague and Paris and London and so forth, Cambridge, and finding the best minds that they could. And of course, one of the most famous was Nikola Tesla, a young Serbian student who was recommended by his professors. So at any rate, they were hired to come to London first, then into New Jersey, New York, and San Francisco, et cetera, and engage in laboratory work around the clock. And they were paid handsomely for it. But what they were doing, right, is to some people in the scientific community, they had become mercenaries because they weren't just pursuing scientific discovery for its own sake. They were pursuing scientific discovery for the sake of the corporations, of what the corporations could better do as far as their production. And one example of that, right, a key example, I think, is streamlining production. All right. And what do I mean by that? I only know the basics, so that's all I'll share. Is with streamlining production, right, is you're cutting off the fat, is the metaphor, right? All the unnecessary parts of production, get rid of them. Simplify production, make it more efficient or quick, right? And cheaper and faster, okay? And they found ways of doing that. And so again, by the 1870s, there was a great use of steam power. The most famous machine was the Corliss, named after George Corliss steam machine. And by the 1890s, electricity had taken off, in particular, alternating current as a source, right? So all this is going on, and the corporations, the state governments, the federal government are all doing their part to let all of this flourish. That's what number one entails, right? Is we're patting ourselves on the back, saying the Industrial Revolution, technically the second one, the big one, was not an accident. We made it happen. We made the fertile soil from which it can grow, okay? And not to mention plenty of natural resources that tended to be very relevant to the industries that were taking off. So in particular, anthracite and bituminous or hard and soft coal, right? To be used in the heating and oxidation process of iron to turn wrought iron into steel. And so, which was much more durable than iron with less carbon.
Sorry, I didn't.
No, don't be sorry.
Are we on a certain question, or are you just giving us going through the slides?
I'm going through the argumentative assignment. Yeah. So I'm going through the argument. So what I wanted to do, Kevin, and maybe it wasn't that, maybe I should have just done one after the other, is what I wanted to do is address the questions that you will have on your first test. Just address what they are to familiarize you with what you'll need to know. Then go through each of the sections and talk about the sections, and then go back to the questions and see whatever we've left out. All right. Is that okay? Is that fair? Okay, good. You know me, I always do everything the roundabout way. So at any rate, let's see here. So you have those components to trying to make a conducive environment for business development. And you also have natural things. Like I said, plenty of hard and soft coal, plenty of subterranean crude oil that they'll make multiple uses out of, right? Gasoline, we're a little ahead of ourselves, not until the first couple decades of the 1900s. But kerosene and refined oil had many purposes, especially lubrication in the factories, as so much became mechanized. And then with the mechanization and the new inventions, right? New machines necessitated machine parts. That actually is what we became famous for as a country. A lot of the machines themselves came from immigrants and from Europeans. A lot of the machine tools came from Americans to better utilize them. And so then, like I said, you got to pay men to become adept at manning the machines, repairing them when something goes awry, right? And getting them back into orderly fashion. And so it's going to be like this avalanche, if you will, that unrolls where one new piece of machinery, one invention spawns a myriad of other either inventions and practices or a myriad of other jobs that will become available. And so to the American dream, you say, okay, this is perfect, right? Because now machines are going to expedite and facilitate and cheapen, for lack of other verbs, make more cheap, right? The production of products. People no longer have to be systematically trained like they did as artisans, right? As skilled workers. So it's kind of de-skilling work. But now that means virtually anybody can do it. And so when you have floods of immigrants coming in from Italy and other countries, right, it works perfectly to be able to immediately employ them at these machines. But then you have white collar jobs like foremen or supervisors that they can move up to theoretically, and other white collar positions of manning the machines and repairing them and controlling them, etc. Those, like I said, providing the machine tools and working the machine tools. It's opening up a myriad of white collar jobs also, from which theoretically the manual laborers might one day ascend to. Okay. And so you have all that. But then a problem arises, right? Kind of moving into the next number. And that is, so that's Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison right there. That's a remake of Menlo Park Laboratory, where they had over 1,000 patents in New Jersey. And we're talking about some cool stuff, you guys, like pre-remote control and just some incredible things. Phonetic sounds being sent, like the beginnings of the phonograph, of being able to play movies, be able the predecessor to the telephone, etc. So at any rate, Karl Marx was right. Capitalism is an unfair economic system rigged for the rich. So the title says everything on number 2, right? You know, if you have a giant against a pygmy and you put them in the ring, how fair is that? When you have people that have access to an incredible amount of capital, money to begin with, namely the corporations, right? Because here's what some of them did is they engaged in vertical integration, all right? Vertical integration. And that is they controlled every step of the production process all the way to the time of the product, the final product being sold to the consumer. Because what they, like with Rockefeller, right? He gets his crew, he starts humble origins and rises up, and we'll get to that in a minute. But he takes a chance on oil. And so his crude oil now has to be shipped. They're going to charge him what they want to charge him, right, on the railroad. Then it's going to be sent to the oil refinery, and they're going to refine it. That's going to cost him money. Then they're going to send it to the wholesalers who have warehouses, who hold it and make the agreements as to where and how much of it is going to be bought at what spot, right? Then you have the advertisers who are advertising the product as well. And so everybody gets a cut from that. So that drove the kind of the control freak and also the frugal man of Rockefeller crazy. And he said, heck with that, I want to control every aspect of the production. And that's exactly what he came to do. So he controlled the oil derricks and the extraction of the crude oil. He bought a majority share on 2 different railroads that he utilized for his oil, and got special rebates for them, which I'm going to get back to in just a minute. He had his own refineries in Chicago, refined his own oil, made his own barrels and his own warehouses, and sent out his own advertisers, and then sold them largely to the East Coast, this refined oil. All right. And so in doing that, however, he made a promise in the famous Lake Shore deal of Michigan. He said, if I could promise you 60 carloads of oil per day, and you get to charge me per pound, I'll be giving you a lot of money, right, to the railroad. He says, I'll tell you what, if I can promise you such a high quantity from which you can enrich yourself, what will you do for me? Because I could also use the other railroad, and I have a steamship that I could have them shipped up to in the Great Lakes. So I have 2 other options, he said. I don't need to go with you. He was very shrewd that way of keeping his options open. So he got them to agree to about a 50% rebate or deduction on the price per pound of his oil. The small guys didn't have that leverage, right? They couldn't do that. And by the way, he couldn't do it either. At that point of his career, he himself could not even produce 60 carloads of crude oil per day. But what he did is he joined assets and he joined oil with a couple of his competitors and said, let's join it together. It'll constitute six carloads a day, or 60. And then we'll all get the rebate together, and we'll separate our oil when it gets to the refineries. And so some of them began doing that. Carnegie and Steel, right? Bethlehem Steel, later US Steel. He made price agreements with some of his competitors and some of the big guys, and said, I'll tell you what, you and I can afford to put our price of steel down to a dangerously low level price for a season. We'll even lose money for a while, but we could sit on that loss, such are our resources, right? But the small guys won't be able to handle it. So let's undersell all the small competitors out of business. Once they're out of business, let's hike up our price extraordinarily together. Instead of competing with each other, let's hike it up together and keep it and make a pact that will keep it at the same high price. And that's exactly what Carnegie did. And so to people, right, to the public, they were furious. It was definitely a knee-jerk reaction. But there was also a philosophical reaction, like there's something that doesn't seem capitalistic and fair about that, right? About them teaming up like that, having price conspiracies. Because after all, when you look at Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations, he said that theoretically, right, that the laws of nature and the laws of men and human nature are going, and laws of economics are going to prevail and keep everybody accountable. And one of them, of course, is just a good old law of competition. So that if you want to have a high price on your commodity, someone else won't. And people will buy that cheaper commodity instead and hold you accountable and force you to lower your price. But not when you gobble up all the small guys and the big guys agree to keep it up high artificially, right? And so Adam Smith's, his musings in The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, which is kind of seen as like a quote Bible for capitalism, it was not working well. It wasn't, things weren't working out according to his plan from that book. And so to a lot of people, they felt like something was inherently unfair and something needs to be done. It's too Darwinian. It's too just predictable. These big corporations are going to gobble up everybody else. And that's exactly what they began to do. They engaged in horizontal integration after that. And horizontal integration is, side to side, gobbling up all your competitors. So for instance, Rockefeller, he would try to provide a win-win situation for his smaller competitors. He would have done his homework and he would have known how much they made in the last 5-10 years, their average revenue, their average overhead, and would come to them and say, you know what, how about you enjoy an early retirement? I'll take the burden of this company off your hands and I'll give you 8% share of Standard Oil. Well, in 1892, one of those years just before the Great Depression, Rockefeller brought in over, it was like 2 billion. It was ridiculous how much money he was making now. He's going to end up, by the way, controlling 90% of the nation's oil. So at any rate, he would tell the people, right, hey, let me take this off your hands. It's a win-win situation. I'll give you 8% share in my company, and you could make virtually the same amount of money doing nothing. Well, some of them took that offer. But when you didn't, they said that he would give you a look that looked like a shark, and he would begin threatening you. And he would say, well, you do know that you have to use either the Pennsylvania Railroad or the Erie Railroad to get your oil to the refineries or to the final places, markets. And I sit on the governing board. I could keep that from happening. And you'll have to go with another railroad. Or we could hike up the prices so that you can't afford it to have your oil sent by us. So then he would begin threatening. And so to a lot of people, like I said, there was something just inherently unfair about this process of the wealthy gobbling up the smaller competition. And not only, right, is the smaller competition termed in conflict history, because remember, conflict history states, right, it's kind of in some ways the antithesis of court history, is it claims that life is about conflict, history is about conflict, conflict moves history in the directions in which it goes, but that the winners politically, economically, and socially are the bad guys. They're the villains. It vilifies them, right? And it wants to elicit our sympathy, our empathy for those who lost. So conflict historians, they refer to the term casualties of progress, that some people were unfairly run over, if you will, by the bus of progress, by the train of progress. So one group would be the skilled workers, the artisans, right? Think of today, it's an anomaly, right? where you see a TV show of someone making by hand motorcycles and selling them to Hollywood stars, right? Very few times something like that works. They can't hang with a Harley Davidson factory and the Asian rockets, if you will, being produced in mass in the factories. And so skilled workers lost to the machines, arguably. Then small scale entrepreneurs, as we just went over, were gobbled up by the big corporations. So they constitute another group that conflict historians want us to empathize with as a casualty of progress. Okay. And then another group is the proletariat. And that's Marx's term for the industrial laborers of the industrial age and economy. So the factory workers mainly, right? And the miners, etc. Because to their idea, right, they feel like the whole American dream was a sham, was a lie, that you have to give false hope to those who are at the bottom, make them feel as if they can move up to a foreman position, to a white collar position, handling the machine someday, to keep them going, right? To keep that carrot in front of them so that they keep moving forward. But that it was largely an illusion, largely a lie. And you look at stats of upward mobility, and they're not very impressive. But of course, my sources are conflict historians, so you got to keep that in mind. But namely, like Howard Zinn and other books like that, very much kind of Marxist in their worldview, and so they definitely have a slant and an agenda. But according to them, the people at the bottom very rarely rose up very highly in increase in wages, to a change from a blue collar manual labor job to a white collar job, etc. And so with that, right, the next step is for the workers to try to agitate for state laws to make regulations over their employers, over their bosses. And those laws, right, you could probably easily guess, pertain to their working conditions. They wanted laws that stated you shall not work more than a 10-hour day. You should not work more than a 6-day week. Certain conditions where there's inhalation of toxic fumes, something ought to be done to protect them from those fumes in the mines in particular, right? Silicosis or miner's lung. And so they agitated for laws like that. And in several states, they received them. West Virginia, Colorado, Missouri, California, New York, okay? But in state after state, the state Supreme Court justices shot them down. And we're gonna get to that soon. So some people say that they had tried the legal means to no avail, and in their despair, in their disillusionment, and feeling like there was no way of legally gaining hope, right? Gaining help, that they became more radical, that denial to them somewhat radicalized the proletariat. So then by the 1890s, you have some very large scale strikes, bloody, destructive strikes, for instance. And then you have the proliferation of unions that became more radical in their methods as well as in their goals. Methods, like I said, including destruction of property, including assassination of certain foremen and leaders at their plants. And by their goals, some of them increasingly embraced different derivations of Marxism.
You seen that movie, The Irishman? It shows pretty good how the union started and how they were destroying companies, the taxis, and stuff like that from the big corporations and stuff to give the smaller companies a good shot.
No, but I tell you what, Kevin, you pretty much have my word that I'm going to watch it now. It's called The Irishman.
Yeah, that's a good movie. It's long.
Yeah.
That's good. It's good.
Okay. I'd definitely like to see it.
At least look up the trailer and tell me what you think.
Okay, sure. Sure. The Irishman. You got it. So, uh, so at any rate, when that happened, right, the government, time after time, is going to sympathize with the employers rather than with the strikers. And they're going to oftentimes use the same pretexts or so-called excuses and saying that they need to keep law and order, right? Because some of the strikes would become destructive in property and even violent in their manifestation. And also in light of libertarian laissez-faire rhetoric, right? Of government needs to stay out of the economy anyway. Let the employers and the employees sort out their own problems without the government getting involved. All right. So all that's in line with number 2, to imply that it just wasn't a fair system. Look at more of the evidence when you get a chance, okay? So you see you have Rockefeller and oil, Vanderbilt and railroads, Carnegie and steel, JP Morgan and financing, then later railroads, then later electricity, and Jay Gould in the stock market. And just look up some of the manipulative things that Jay Gould did in the stock market alone. And it's very interesting. Just some very immoral things. So number 3, winners like Rockefeller at least partially earned their success. Now notice I take a 180 from number 2 and I play the devil's advocate. I said, well, okay, maybe the system didn't seem fair. Maybe there was definitely a privileged position from which the corporations were sitting that gave them undue leverage over their competitors and undue leverage over their workers, over their laborers. But let's not forget the fact that some of them really did rise from rags to riches, and that some of them really did exemplify some characteristics that are very amenable to success. So for instance, not too long ago, an American titan, business titan, boasted very arrogantly, you could take all the money from the wealthiest in America, he said, and equally allocate it to everybody else in the country. But he said, in 10 years, you let the system go back to itself and each person on his or her own. He said, in 10 years, we'll all virtually be back in the same position we're in right now. What do you think he meant by that?
Pretty much just saying that poor make poor choices.
Okay, good. Good. No, I mean, that in itself is not good. Trust me, I'm not saying that's good, but good in that it's accurate, right? Of what you're saying. Is saying that those who are poor deserve to be poor. They're in a position in which they're of their own making. They've made their own bed. And conversely, right, those who are rich, they have the qualities that will get them rich again if you were to take their money.
I think that I think that it's like money belongs in the hands of the people who can make the money is what I kind of think.
Okay, good. Okay, so that's a very popular conservative argument for sure, right? And now, what are some characteristics, Jaden? What are some characteristics of people that you think can make money, as differentiated from those who cannot? Oh, you're muted, Jaden.
I think it's kind of a mindset mostly, is like more of the wealthy people know how to have the mindset of that they're learning how to and make investments and try to get out there, and that the people who are not making money are kind of afraid to actually step out there, and like they more have boundaries.
Good. All right. And hopefully you see some of that here, right? Rockefeller, 16 years old, working, doing the lion's share of work, evidently, for Hewitt and Tuttle, a produce company, and begins saving up his money, saves up $800, and he's only making $15 a month. Saves up $800 in a pretty respectably short time. He also ran his neighbor's farm for a portion of the earnings as a teenager, right? This is a precocious kid, and never spent it, was very frugal, but made the decision to, he also was a good Baptist, and he tithed his money, he gave to missions, he cleaned the church and swept it without any payment, and volunteered a lot of work at his local church. And a local parishioner caught his eye. He caught that parishioner's eye, and the guy was willing to give him a generous loan because he trusted his integrity. And so he saves money, he borrows money, and then he encourages one of the brothers, because one of the brothers evidently was verbally abusive to him, that was running this produce company, and convinces him to, almost provokes him in an argument, to offer the business up for sale. And he didn't know Rockefeller had that money. And just in a moment of machismo, he said, fine, put it up for sale. He says, I'll buy it again, and I'll fire you. And it went up for sale, and the next morning Rockefeller bought it out from underneath their noses. Yes.
I did just want to add to a little bit to what Jaden was saying, because I do agree with him. I do think that you need a certain mindset in order to be successful and stuff like that. But I mean, I think it's important to understand that generational wealth was a huge factor in these things, and generational wealth was taken away from a lot of culture, and these opportunities, like you mentioned, for Rockefeller, what were the odds of a colored person getting a loan at that time, even if they did have a good idea,
No, that's a great counter perspective, and it has to be acknowledged, as a counterpoint to be considered, for sure. And as far as generational wealth, right, one of them was, and that was J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan's dad was a big bank executive and involved in insurance companies and had international ties. And J.P. Morgan, early on at the time of the Civil War, was able to get huge loans from his dad and from his father's connected bank to be able to sell produce and sell guns to the Union Army. And the fact of the color line, that absolutely has to be considered, for sure. The Jim Crow laws were alive and well at this time in the Gilded Age. Again, there were fewer than 10 states that really gave full citizenship rights to African American men in the North, even. Because remember, they had to give their basic ones. They had to be able to vote, and they technically could run for office and stuff. But as far as gerrymandering and manipulating their voting districts, segregating them in housing, and so forth, it absolutely was a fact of life. So that is something to remember, for sure. And remember, the two points made by you and Jaden are not mutually exclusive. That there's a degree to which things were open up for merit, and certain qualities, certain mindsets were in more conducive to success, but yet there were still some barriers like color of skin and also gender, right? For women, that it didn't matter. It virtually didn't matter what your mindset was or wasn't. Okay, good. All right, and so that's what you're looking for here. Carnegie, right? 14-year-old kid working as a bobbin boy for a telegraph company or for a textile company. He goes above and beyond every day, gets the attention of a guy named Thomas Scott. Thomas Scott gets him to come work for his telegraph company. He does so well that he invites him to be a superintendent of his Pennsylvania Railroad. He makes a clutch decision in a time when there's a backup of cars stuck on the railroad tracks. He makes a controversial decision in the absence of Thomas Scott to destroy the first two cars and just lose the money on them of the merchandise to get them off the track and get the others to be able to go to their destination. He thought literally he might be fired for such a decision, and instead he was promoted. And then knowing the right guy, Thomas Scott offered him, told him to put his own mother's house up for collateral to buy on margin, on credit, some stock in, American Express and Pullman Palace cars. And he was, before long, he's still a teenager. He's making over $5,000 a year just off those investments, which was a lot back then. He travels back to Scotland to meet family, and he becomes aware of the Bessemer oven and the Bessemer process of making steel, and brings back a man with the last name of Gordon. And Gordon knew steel very well, and became his superintendent in his factories. Had an affable personality that just was very winsome, evidently. And a guy named Henry Clay Frick took a liking to him, and Frick owned lots of soft coal. And so they became partners for Frick's coal and for Carnegie's Bessemer ovens. And before you know it, they're producing steel. And so you find kind of through pluck and luck. And there was a guy who wrote dime store novels at this time. His name was Horatio Algier. And Horatio Algier wrote stories of these kids growing up that through pluck and luck, having the right mindset, as you said, and being frugal, being self-disciplined, being diligent or a hard worker, being intelligent and shrewd, taking risks, as Jaden said, and being willing to, to jump into something and put all of your money into something. Because you got to recall too that Carnegie and a couple others, they tried certain ventures that failed miserably, and they had to recover from it. And so having that venturous type spirit helped. But in light of what Kevin said, none of the protagonists of Horatio Algier's novels were Black. And so that is something to consider. All right. So that's what you have in number 3. It's a 180 from number 2. It's a conservative counter argument, saying, no, there still was an element of meritocracy involved, where some of these people actually somewhat earned their success. Okay. Then number 4, our plutocratic government favored big business. A plutocracy is ruled by the wealthy in cahoots with the governing authorities, right? That they're in each other's pockets. And so again, the guise supposedly of laissez-faire economics was just that, according to number 4, was just a guise. It was an excuse to not help out the underlings, the underdogs, the laborers, and the small scale farmers and entrepreneurs. And so you see that with decisions that were made that shot down regulatory legislation. And when I mean regulatory legislation, I mean legislation that regulated the number of hours workers could work, the amount of pay, like the beginnings of minimum wage laws. They were shot down by the judiciary at this time. All right. Unions tried to be recognized by legal precedent, and they were grudgingly in 1842. There was a case that acknowledged them, but it was very, very lukewarm as far as saying what they were entitled to. For instance, it didn't even state that they had the right of collective bargaining to be able to go to the table and negotiate their own conditions with their bosses. So very, very lukewarm support of the unions. And then again, why, if they were laissez-faire, did they have protective tariffs? And who benefited from the protective tariffs? Arguably the big corporate manufacturers, right? Who were able to artificially keep their prices higher and not have to get in price wars with their international competitors. Because the conservative argument was that it was going to trickle down. And to some historians, they don't buy into that at all. The idea that, okay, that with a higher price and higher profits because of the protective tariffs, they're able to hire more workers. They're able to expand in new facilities, and the new facilities, they'll be paying someone lease or mortgage payments for the land. They'll bring in more machinery. So the machine makers and the machine repairers are going to have a job, and that it's going to trickle down to everyone. I'm not saying there's no validity to that. I'm saying it's contested. So in this particular argument, I am saying that there's no validity to that, that the tariffs were the rich man's help. Again, Granger laws were shot down. The Wabash versus Illinois, what they stated was, well, you can't put a price ceiling on the railroad rates that they're charging everybody because the railroads are crossing state lines. So technically that would be interstate commerce, and only Congress can do that. So state after state had its regulatory measures shot down by the judiciary. And remember, with the judiciary, yes, on the one hand, they were schooled in laissez-faire academics. They were taught that that was the norm. Government stay out, right? Private enterprise, latitude of employers to form whatever contracts they want. Remember, right? The freedom to contract is, they said, a natural right. But again, if they were so for it, why were they okay with tariffs? That's not laissez-faire. And not only that, many of them, of these judges, had been railroad and corporate lawyers before becoming judges. And many of them also owned stock in some of the corporations that they defended in their decisions. So clearly there's evidence of a conflict of interest as well. As in the case of the Pullman strike, Richard Olney was a Secretary of State, but he was a major shareholder in one of the railroads that was being destroyed. And he'd been a corporate lawyer for the railroads for years before becoming Secretary of State. And what did he do? He issued an injunction to the strike, whereby the court declared the strike to be illegal, destructive of property. Now, technically, was it destructive of property? Yes. Technically, the First Amendment, we have the right to peaceably protest. So technically, that is overstepping their First Amendment rights, to play devil's advocate, because they were literally blowing up and setting on fire the railroad cars. So then when something was finally done, the argument is it was lukewarm at best. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. This act, right, stated that railroads must post their rates ahead of time, and the rates must be uniform for everybody. And the rates should be reasonable and just. But it took them over 5 years to even come up with a commission to enforce it. So it wasn't even enforced. The Sherman antitrust law was very vaguely worded. Said no conspiracies or unions shall be formed in restraint of trade and competition. Because remember the Lakeshore deal. Also, you could look up South Improvement Company. by Rockefeller. He was joining up with a lot of guys and doing some nefarious stuff. But again, people contend there was no teeth. There were no teeth in the Sherman antitrust law. No enforcement mechanisms. It was left up to the Department of Justice in a few years to take cases to court and let judges decide. And the number of cases in the 1890s was ridiculously low. I believe it was in the single digits of people taking a corporate trust to court. Because it's the government itself that had to make the initiative rather than the lobbyist groups that represented the very demographics that were being victimized by the trusts. So it's just so unfair. So look at this. I love metaphoric political cartoons. Look at this pitiful union leader on his emaciated steed or donkey trying to take on the monopolies, particularly the railroad. And then lastly, what I want you to know is Alan Trachtenberg. He contends, when you look at the fact that the disparity of wealth did increase between the rich and the poor, right? Let me see here. Look at that. The top 1% owned 88% of the assets. 10 million lived below the poverty line. I think I've already done that, but I just want to show that again. The strikes that are going on, the class consciousness that's developing. When I say class conscious developing, think in terms of like when I asked you, what are you? Think about the first thing that popped into your head. Was it your ethnicity or nationality? Was it your gender? Was it your religious association, your religious beliefs and identification? What was it, right? To Karl Marx and the Marxists, they want a time to happen in which the proletariat in particular develops a consciousness of the fact that first and foremost, they are manual laborers. They are industrial workers. And there's a sense of camaraderie and cohesion amongst them. That was happening supposedly in the late 1800s, class consciousness developing, supposedly. Literally, the Secretary of State, Graham, said he was concerned about a revolution happening, basically a class war. Such was his fear in looking at these violent strikes. You got to remember the 1877 railroad strike. I have a PowerPoint with some data on it that I'll be happy to post. The Pullman strike. They stretched over several states. People that had no work pertaining to the railroad joined them, just out of class anger toward the railroads. When Pinkertons or private policemen were hired to come against them, they fearlessly fought them. And they even fought National Guard members of the states coming to take them on. It was getting ugly. Trachtenberg says, it's not fair to simply blame the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. It was bigger than that, he said. It was a systematic economic He likens it to a mighty river, an irresistible river current that no one could have stopped. And he mainly focuses upon mechanization, the increasing production of goods by machines in his book. And he emphasizes the vagaries of the market. Time and time again, right? Suddenly a drop demand for their goods, drop prices for their goods. A recession or even depression, like in 1893, and they were unable to pay back their loans. Even the Rockefellers, right, once they were very successful, still regularly took out loans and assumed that things would go as planned and continue as they had done, and they'd be able to pay those loans back. And stated, right, that they felt precarious even when they were the big guys who had vertically and horizontally integrated. And that they felt compelled, at times at least, to lower their workers' wages, to lay off some of their workers, to work them longer hours, to give them that competitive edge to be able to handle the storm and to be able to continue to beat out their competitors. That the system was almost compelling them to be ruthless to their competitors, but primarily focuses upon ruthlessness toward their workers, their laborers. So hate the system, not the system's winners. All right, Alan Trachtenberg's thesis. So any questions, you guys? Glad to see you guys still here. I see another name. Can I get some thumbs up? You guys feel better about this? You guys feel like you've gained something from, thank you, Lasaida.
Yeah, I think that there's one question about the robber barons.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah.
What's that?
So I have a question about that. So just about robber barons in general.
So robber barons, right?
Mm-hmm.
Robber barons were the ones that vertically and horizontally integrated. They were the industrial bosses who virtually took control of all aspects of production all the way to sale of their product, right? And needed no middlemen to work with. And they began to gobble up their competitors and basically initiate virtual monopolies in their sectors, in their it's the word I'm thinking of, their industries, right? So Rockefeller and oil, Carnegie and steel, James Duke and tobacco, Cyrus McCormick with agricultural machinery, Gustavus Swift with meat packing. So they were controversial. To some people, they were praised and looked upon, right, as rock stars of their age. Saying like that number that we have on Rockefeller, right? That they earned what they got. They deserved it. They worked their way up. And then to other people, they were villains. They were sharks. And everybody else that they worked for, that worked for them, or that especially competed with them, were minnows. and that just the system, something about it was just not fair. And they were associated with avaricious greed, that they could never have enough. Okay.
Okay. Thank
You're
you.
welcome, Jaden. I appreciate having you. All right. So are there any last questions before we leave? What's that?
Oh, just thank you.
You're very welcome. All right. So anybody else? Any questions before we call it a day? All right, good. All right, you guys have a great week, okay? Thank you. I have all your names. You'll get your extra credit points. You've certainly earned them. And I hope this helps you do this assignment.
Okay. Thank you, Derek.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Laura.
I have one more question.
Yes, sir.
So when is the test going to be?
The first.
The test will be the week after next.
Okay.
And
Thank
I'll
you.
give you a full week as I do with the assignments.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll do Gilded Age Part 2 next week, and then the following week you'll have all week to do test 1.
Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
See you next week.
All right, sounds good, Jaden. All right, you guys have a great week, okay? Thank you.
Okay.
Enjoy having you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.